Welcome to Book Club. I'm really into fun facts. Julie has an endless array of pop culture knowledge. Overall, I would say I liked it.
Something about the way she writes is like really concrete and immediate. Who is this man? Why is he in this costume? Like, why did he drop a squid? Like, you teased some juicy deets about the creation of this book.
This is, again, what Victoria finds interesting, not what is actually most important about these people.
What stories are we going to tell ourselves about this year?
Welcome to the party.
Welcome, guys.
Welcome to Book Club
with Julia
and Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends since high school who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as a tool for personal and community growth.
This week we are reading The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint Exupery. I hope I pronounced that right. And there will be spoilers, though this book has been out for a very, very long time. But if you are a person who doesn't like to know about the book before they read it, you have officially been warned.
And we are so excited to welcome a guest to the podcast this week, Sofia Syntaxx. Welcome, Sofia.
Ani Bojo, Sofia Nadishnakaj. I'm so happy to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
We are so stoked. This is Sofia Syntaxx, an Anishinaabe indigiqueer artist, activist, researcher, and educator. You may remember Sofia from reading their blog, Too Sexy for Contacts, listening to them host the ANGR Podcast, or watching them perform burlesque as the tattooed tapper and clever linguist. Specializing in nerdalesque, clowning, and fetish performance, Sofia's talents extend beyond the stage. They are also an accomplished glassblower and photographer. To connect with them on social media and see samples of their work, you can go to link.tree/Sofia Syntaxx. That's with 2 X's. And we'll put a link in the show notes for you all.
That's right, 2 X's, because my syntax is extreme. But not 3 X's, because it's not pornographic. That's a mistake that gets made a lot. I'm like, no.
Oh,
that's not part of my brand. Sorry. Sorry to disappoint.
So, Sofia, this is really exciting for Julie and I to have you on. This is the first time we've had a guest that wasn't already a friend of ours, in real life. And this is our first Instagram friend on the podcast. We also love listening to your show. So this is a collaboration we've been excited to have for a while.
Yeah.
Oh, Chi McWedge, thank you. I was so excited when you reached out to me because I thought, wow, these are the first people who I don't know who are listening to my show. I really thought it was just my Gnocomus, my grandma, my cousins, my Facebook friends. Yeah. So it was a big moment for me. So I'm excited that we can interlap our internet worlds. And it's funny, too, that you mentioned the Bookstagram because I was just listening to your episode today about Bookstagram. And I think that's actually how I found you guys originally. Was the review you had done about There.
Yeah.
A book that had 12 characters who I didn't care about any, but we're not going to talk about that today. I'll come back.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
We definitely we'll do a follow-up.
We're going to talk about something I actually like today, which is The Little Prince. I am oh my gosh, so excited. This is probably my favorite book ever.
Amazing.
Period. And so as you mentioned in my bio, which thank you, Victoria, you did a great job making me sound awesome. So I am Anishinaabe. I grew up speaking Ojibwe. My grandfather spoke Ojibwe with me at home. And so it was something that was always around. And then when I went to Michigan State University, I was able to study with Helen Roy to take formally Ojibwe as a foreign language, which was super cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was so cool. I felt really validated.
Yeah.
Wow, okay, if a, top 10 state university is teaching my indigenous language, it must be, a legitimate academic subject.
Yeah.
And funny enough, that team, some of those people are who worked on the translation of this book.
Oh.
Well, not Michigan State. Now I'm crossing my streams. They're from University of Michigan. But the translation team, one of the people that worked on this was Margaret Newton. And then my mentor from when I was at Michigan State, Rachel Butson, did the beautiful floral Anishinaabe Ojibwe cover art. And that was another, I was like, oh my God. I think that might have been the post that I shared on Instagram that you guys saw. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Oh, not only is my favorite book being translated into my indigenous language, it's just whoa, holy cow, I can't believe this is happening. But then I know know the lady who did the art. And I was just, it was really, really great. And then reading the book, I have to admit, we were talking a little bit before we got started about when you read a book and maybe the author name, you don't know the name because you've read it a certain way, or there's certain words you've only ever read, you've never heard them pronounced. There were definitely some Ojibwe words in this book and this translation as I was reading. I'm like, I am not sure that I have got that right. But hopefully I didn't embarrass my ancestors too much.
Yeah.
I did my best.
So you also mentioned before we hit record that you own this book in multiple different translations. Now Ojibwe, also I'm just assuming English at some point. What other languages have you collected?
Okay, so of course, English was the first one I got. My mom introduced me to this book when I was really young. It just was sort of ubiquitous with my life growing up. It was like this book was always around, and it was what inspired me to learn French. Well, that and Gambit from the X-Men, but again, that's a whole other story. I wanted to learn French because the original book was written in French, Le Petit Prince, and so I started taking French in high school. I went on in university. I minored in French. So
wow.
Yeah, all of like so obsessive, all because of this one freaking book. And so that's what I did with my life. My mom's so proud. So I've got it in French, of course, and then it was, I moved on to Spanish. Then 2 years ago I got a Fulbright, and that was really transformative to my research, to my academic career, just my whole life, my whole gig. kind of got uprooted. I went to Europe, and then as I was traveling around Europe, I was just like, you know what? Every place I go, I'm gonna get a copy of this book.
Oh my god!
Oh, that's awesome.
Because it just seemed like why wouldn't I?
Yeah.
Right? Actually, The Little Prince has been translated. I think it's 445 language and dialects.
Yeah.
Wow.
I picked one up in Bulgarian, Romanian, Turkish, Greek. And there was another one too, but it's escaping me at the moment. But yeah, I've got this book and lots of copies.
Oh my god.
And especially with the Hungarian version, I don't speak Hungarian. I sloughed through it just to, give it a try.
Oh my.
Yeah.
I don't know how it's successful, but I know the story in and out.
Right.
So, and it's really cool to see the different translations and how they talk about the different themes in the book and the way that's handled. As this book has sort of grown with me, because, of course I got the original in English, which is, I'm a native speaker of English, and seeing how these themes that I love are translated into the Romance languages like French or Spanish, and then seeing now as an adult how they're translated into my indigenous language of Anishinaabemowin, which, by the way, Anishinaabemowin is the name of our indigenous language in our indigenous language. Our tribe is Anishinaabe, but you might also know us. You might also remember us as the Chippewa or the Ojibwe. So all three names for the same tribe. You can use them interchangeably.
Oh, that's so awesome. I love that idea of a souvenir that is not only super meaningful, but also kind of tracks your journeys while you were on your Fulbright. I love all of this. I'm books and travel and language. It's this is why our internet friendship has grown. So I had not read this book. It was one of those that I'm how have I not made it here yet? It's just one of those classics sitting on the shelf. This and A Wrinkle in Time are the two big children's books that I haven't read yet. But it was great to have an excuse, I needed one, but an excuse to sit down and read this one. I have a beautiful copy from the library that I was excited to get. I think it's the 2000 edition. It was translated by Richard Howard. So he had a little intro in the front about his experience translating the book, and kind of notes about how translation, I don't know. It was interesting how his perspective on translation was even though the original work is the same, as our society continues to change and develop, and as our language shifts and morphs over time, it was time to bring another translation to the 21st century. So I found that fascinating. Yeah, I think a lot of the themes resonated with me, which we'll get more into, but I really wish I would have had this in my life when I was younger. I wish I would have picked it up as a child. I'm really curious what young me would have thought, because I've always kind of been that person who wanted to be at the next stage of life. I spent probably the ages of 6 to 11 wanting to be age 12. I don't know why, but 12 was very important to me. And I thought great things were going to happen at age 12, which they did. My family moved from Michigan to California. How did I know? Like, the biggest move of my life was going to happen at age 12. But yes, this whole book about, like, what it means to be a grown-up, what it means to be a child, and how you can keep that, like, childhood wonder in your adulthood.
Yeah, and definitely, like, when I read it as a kid, it was more straightforward, like, you know, this is the story, this is the little prince, and he's moving through the planets, and this is what he's doing, blah, 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 blah. And now as an adult, I see it more as, like, an allegory, and my perspective has shifted a bit. Like, I'm no longer the little prince. I'm the pilot now. Which is, like, so dismal. It's so dismal. It's so abysmal. Like, oh, I'm the adult now in my biplane that breaks down.
It was the same thing for me. Like, I feel like I kind of knew this. I mean, this book is everywhere, and it's like so internationally, universally beloved. I see references to it all the time, and I kind of knew the basics of the Little Prince story, but I had no idea about the frame story of the narrator. I had no idea. Took me completely by surprise. And that's the part, like you were saying, like reading this as an adult, that's the part I latched onto. And I immediately was like, this is a war book. I had no context for it beforehand, but I was like, this is a dude. He was fighting in a war. His plane crashed in the desert. And he's like hallucinating.
Now he's working through some things.
Yes.
And especially, you know, I'm a military veteran. And so, like, then when I came back from the military and I was reading this book, I was like, homeboy's got PTSD.
Yes! Immediately I knew what it was. And it reminded me a bit of The Hobbit, too, in terms of, like, the, like, tone and, like, someone who's been through war, who has lost a lot of people and is searching for this kind of escapism and, like, trying to find the essentials of human nature and comfort and inner childhood and kind of a worship of nature. Like, there's so many parallels that I was like, this feels very similar. I know who this guy is. And it really resonated with me. And I was like so fascinated by it. Because I think part of the reason I never read it was because I was like, oh, well, it's like an allegorical book about a little boy who hops around planets. Didn't sound that exciting to me, but now that I've read it, I'm like, oh, there's so many layers. And the fact that it's a tragedy in a children's book, like, oh, baby. Yeah, I absolutely loved it. And then I looked up the author bio later, and I was right. And I was like, my instincts are honed.
I can find a wounded man trope a mile away.
Yes. Yeah. All right, you want to do the, who is Antoine de Saint Exupery?
I love that you just said his name, so now I can just refer to him as the author.
Great.
Thanks for taking that one.
You're welcome.
So our author, he was born in 1900 in Lyon, France, to an aristocratic family, though they were quite impoverished. I'm reading this all from the Encyclopedia Britannica, so if you want to come at me with your... every time we do like a really well-known author, I'm like, someone's going to come at me someday being like, you missed this very important detail. I'm like,
well, hey, that's why we have podcast listeners to help us fill in the gaps.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
We're all learning. We're all on this journey together.
Exactly.
So he began studying architecture at a fine arts school in Paris when he was a young adult, but he was conscripted to the French Air Force in 1921 and became a pilot. So throughout the later 1920s, he helped establish airmail routes all over Northwest Africa, the South Atlantic, and South America. But he also started writing during this time. His first novel was published in 1929. Throughout the 1930s, he was a test pilot for Air France, as well as a reporter, and continued to write and publish, including Wind, Sand, and Stars. That's the English title of that book. And that received the U.S. National Book Award in 1939. I found that particularly interesting because the National Book Award is awarded, I believe the criteria is books written, majority published in the US. Like they can be foreign authors and they can be from other languages, but they have to have like a distinct English version. So this book was distinct enough. It wasn't just a straight translation. Anyways, that's a side note about National Book Awards. But he fled to the US in 1940 with his wife and they lived for 3 years in New York. And during this time, he wrote The Little Prince and it was published. He did, though, return to Europe to fly with his French squadron in the Mediterranean theater of the war. And about a year later, in 1944, he went on a reconnaissance mission over France and never returned. The wreckage of his flight was found 6 years later near Marseille. And so, yeah, a pretty tragic end.
Wow.
And, I mean, kind of fitting, kind of sadly fitting for the end of The Little
Very
Prince.
on brand.
Yeah. Maybe some
Yeah.
premonitions about what was to come. But The Little Prince was originally published in both French and English. It was published in the US because that's where he was currently living, and because France was being occupied by the Nazis, it wasn't published in France until after the war in 1946. So initially the critics were kind of like, what is this book? Is it for children? Is it for adults? It was based off of some like actual like true life experiences. So he also, you know, as a pilot crashed into the desert in Libya, and he obviously survived to write about the tale, but faced dehydration and hallucination and had a really insane experience that might have very likely been, you know, some fodder for this story. And then this part I found interesting. His wife, her name Consuelo, is said to have some like erratic behavior, according to Encyclopedia Britannica. I don't know who decided she was erratic. But anyways, there's been stories that she was similar to that of like the Princess Rose in The Little Prince. And later she published an autobiography called The Tale of the Rose. That was kind of a nod to like, yes, I am the rose.
Gotta own the term, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, get your money, girl.
Yeah.
Get it. Like, right when she was behaving erratically, she was upset that her husband was conscripted into a war.
Yeah, and like died a tragic plane crash death.
Right. How erratic that she wasn't happy that her husband died for capitalism.
Oh no.
That's actually more than I ever knew about this author. So
Yeah.
thank you. For all my love of the book, it's just one of those like don't meet your heroes things. I didn't want to know
Right.
because I was like, if he turns out to be, you know, a domestic abuser, I'm gonna have to scrap most of my childhood and, you know, most
Yeah.
of my travel abroad. So let me just not know. If I don't know about it, I don't have to cancel him.
I'm going to summarize it real quick so that we can get into the juicy stuff. So this is the story of, it's not necessarily the story of A Little Prince. The frame story of this book is that there's a pilot who crashes in the Sahara Desert, and while he's there, he thinks about his early childhood drawing career, and this little boy shows up from another planet asteroid B612, who demands a drawing of a sheep. And they spend, while the pilot is fixing his plane over the course of like a week, the prince slowly over time reveals the story of his journey to the pilot. And so he tells the story of his home planet, how there's a rose in a glass case, 3 volcanoes, one of which is dormant, and they're only about the height of his knees. He can watch the sunset as many times a day as he needs to, depending on how sad he is. And he has a baobab tree infestation, where every single day he has to dig them out of the ground, or they will take over his planet and break it into pieces. For some reason, he sets off on a journey and he hops around to different planets and meets all these adults who just like are in their own worlds and are really like not great people. And he gets increasingly frustrated with adulthood. And he comes to Earth and he befriends a fox who reminds him to cherish and keep close the things and the people that he loves. And he sort of despairs of the adult world, and that's where he meets the pilot. And then a few days later, he asks his friend, a poisonous snake, to bite him so that he can travel back to his planet without his body. And the pilot is sad and asks the readers to look for him in the Sahara. So it is an absolutely devastating book about your inner child and the things that adults make up can sort of break the world. So yeah, that's that.
This podcast is made possible by our fantastic book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. Starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive posts and messages, get early and discounted access to future events, and more. And if you want to take your support to the next level, you can join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community? A possible neurodiverse person looking for resources? Or an ally hoping to learn more from an actually autistic person? Members of this tier get free access to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. Follow the link in our show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. That's buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. We'll see you there.
It feels like this book has sort of universal appeal in a way. I haven't met a single person who was like, nope, The Little Prince, hated it, didn't mean anything to me. There seems to be this sort of essential search for your inner child, an essential kind of humanness that we're all looking for, some kind of inner truth, and kind of a dissatisfaction with the adult world that seems to transcend language and culture fairly universally. And so we wanted to talk about that today.
Yeah, definitely. I agree that as this story moves from one language to another, the core meaning, the core themes of the story stay the same, but every translation offers a different perspective and way of thinking that I think contributes to a greater shared understanding. Like when I look at the translation in English and then when I compare it to what's in French, and then when I take it and I compare it to Anishinaabemowin, I can sort of see this this similar fundamental idea transposed in three different ways. So so one of my favorite parts of the story is when the little prince visits with the fox before leaving. So of course, he's met the fox, and the whole shebang with having the fox be tamed. I love that whole interaction between the little prince and the fox. You've got to come at the same time every day. There was at a point when I was living in Detroit, and there was this feral cat that I was trying to tame, and I actually I was like, all right, I'm going to do it just like the little prince tamed the fox. I'm going to take Mama Kitty her food at 2:00 every day, and I'm just going to set it out there. I'm going to pop the top, and I'm just going to watch. And then every day I'm going to move it a little bit closer until finally the cat, 4 months later, finally has let me pet. I was like, yes, Little Prince life hack solved my life yet again. Excellent. You haven't let me down yet, Antoine. Thank you. Haven't let me down yet. So
incredible.
So when the Little Prince, when he visits with the fox before leaving, we can see in the translations, specifically I'm looking at the French versus the English, where how separation and secrets are sort of viewed in each language. French and English are both in the same Indo-European family, so the differences are more subtle than what we see in the Anishinaabemowin translation. So excuse me while I just linguistic nerd out for a second.
Please, this is why we had you on.
When we move between the differences between French and English, we see in the French version, he says, "Adieu, dit le renard. Voici mon secret. Il est très simple. On ne voit bien qu'avec le cœur. L'essentiel est invisible pour les yeux." And it's very similar to this English translation of "Goodbye," said the fox, and now here it is, my secret, a very simple secret. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Okay, so if you churn that French through Google Translate, it's going to be pretty similar. And even you can see it when you're looking at it, the way the language is structured, the syntax, the grammar is very similar. But when we take that same sentiment and we move it into a language of another family, in this case, we're talking about the Anishinaabemowin, an interjection becomes a verb phrase and a promise to be together again, and the metaphors get changed completely. It's not the same. There isn't a comparison between seeing with one's heart or with one's eyes. Instead, it's a reminder that by letting go of what is material, we can best understand emotions and ideas. So the literal translation of this same phrase, which I'm going to read to you in Anishinaabemowin, is closer to "I will see you again." So he says, "Giga wabamun, ogiji idamini wagushan, nun gum giiwi windamun gadauyan winipinag, mi eta dash jiwi nishida windan, api Bunagizigetagadagioyan, Bawa, Wabanajideg, Mambamawigishi, Ini Dagawag." So this is closer to "I will see you again," said the fox. Now I will tell you what I've been hiding, which is simple. You will understand when you let go of everything that the unseen is most important. So we don't get that cutesy little, eye, heart metaphor.
Right.
But we don't need that because culturally in Ojibwe culture, we don't that's not the audience that we're pandering to. That's not who we're trying to appeal to. So I think that is sort of when we see the magic of the Little Prince encapsulated in this translation, and just that by listening to him, by listening to the Little Prince, by listening to this inner child, we learn to listen better to ourselves and all the things around us that have these secrets to share, whether that be the fox in the field or, the little feral cat in your neighborhood. We just gotta open it up and look around. So that's definitely my favorite part of the book, and I think a really good example of some of the strengths in translation.
Yeah.
Because I prefer to think of it in strengths. It's not that one language is better suited to the story than another. It's just what parts of the stories get highlighted based on the words that we're using to tell it.
That just made my heart so happy.
I was I would like to attend an entire lecture. I appreciate you taking the time to think it through and share with us how the nuances of these different translations, and even just beginning with that translation into Ojibwe of goodbye being I will see you again. To me, that's even more beautiful, in the context of the story, because
Yes.
there is this sense of loss, and there's a lot of conversations about losing or not appreciating certain things in life, and for the fox to not just be goodbye, this is it, which can have more finality in English, to say I will see you again.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and in Ojibwe, and that reflects a very Ojibwe, a very indigenous way of thinking, because we believe once we meet somebody, there is no goodbye, because we always know that person. They're always part of our circle, and whether I see you again tomorrow or in another lifetime, you're always going to be part of my circle. Our energies have exchanged. So you can really see that in that translation example you pulled out.
Yeah, I have another question for you.
Yeah.
What I was kind of getting from your description of in the English and French, we distinguish between seeing with our eyes and seeing with our heart. But in the Ojibwe translation, they didn't make that distinction. Is that a part of the language or the culture that seeing with your eyes and with your heart is the same thing? That was what my brain immediately jumped to, but I'm curious if that is at all accurate.
That is a good question. That is a good question, and I'm going to answer this from my sphere of knowledge, of course. I can't speak for the translators,
right?
And oh my gosh, if any of them ever listen, they hear my Ojibwe. Hopefully, my ancestors aren't ashamed of me. That's all I have to say. I'm doing my best. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and that's the hard thing for people who might not be familiar with Anishinaabemowin, to dive into a book filled with, these long lines. Ojibwe isn't a agglutinative language, so it means it's think of a beaded necklace that has lots of little pieces on it. And you can move the beads around and it's still the same necklace, and it doesn't really matter what order the beads are on. Also, it's polysynthetic, so the order, you can change the order around, and you can do that.
Wow.
The fact that you can, it's not a fixed word order like English is. So for somebody who's not familiar with Anishinaabemowin, who's not familiar with Ojibwe, to dive into this book, I think could be really intimidating.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that the spelling system used in this book is this Firo double vowel system. And this is the most common writing system that we use in the Southern Great Lakes region. And it's a folk phonetic system. The way I spell even my name is different than if I go to Minnesota and I spell it different dialects. So there's a lot of fluidity. So, we're not even within the same tribe. There are different clans, there's different areas of this tribe, so it's not all the same. So I have to say that. But circling back to your original question, I do think that this reflects this when we talk about the hearts and the eyes in English and French, and we don't have that direct translation in Ojibwe, it doesn't frame the sentiment in that way. It's more about letting go of material things. And I think that is very reflective of an indigenous way of thinking, especially in Anishinaabemowin. Culturally, I will be doing an episode of this on my podcast in the future.
Shameless
Just
plug.
saying. Shameless plug. You can listen on Spotify and Deezer. I will be doing a podcast on the 7 grandfathers' teachings in the future, hopefully, but just on a real basic level. The 7 grandfather teachings in Ojibwe culture are basically like how we look at the world, and one of those teachings is love and like doing everything from a point of love and like treating things with respect. And I think that we see as the little prince goes through each of these worlds, like the adults kind of like, they kind of blow him off. They don't really take him seriously. He asks questions. They don't really answer him. And I think in this Ojibwe translation that I pulled out, it's more like you have to understand that these unseen things are important. Just because it's not right in front of your face, just not because it's not obvious, doesn't mean that it's not important. And I think we see that more reflected in the language in the Ojibwe version than we do in the English and French. But that's my highly untechnical, take it for what it's worth, answer to that question.
Yeah. That's
so
great.
It is. They definitely do change the metaphors moving from language to language.
Yeah, I feel like we could talk about metaphors for a solid 3 more hours. But my main question for the group is like, and this could be the first time you read it or as you've read it over time, like what did this book sort of initially bring up in you? Was there like a thing that adults said was really important but doesn't actually matter at all, or maybe some creative part of you that got shut down that you're trying to bring out later in life? Kind of what does this book, what's the first thing it brings out of you, like that you really resonate with?
Oh, for me, it's that quote about what is essential is invisible to the eyes. Mm-hmm. That has been and always been, whether it's in French or it's in English. Less so. It's easier, or I mean, it's more difficult to cross-stitch the Anishinaabemowin version because, it's quite long. So you can't really put that on a pillow. But, even in the Anishinaabemowin version, like, it still slaps for me. I think that is, like, the key takeaway. And if, if Parisian tourist shops are to be believed, that is also the key takeaway, because I got so many postcards and just like trinkets and tchotchkes and crap when I was in France, because I was like, oh yes, Little Prince, he is taken off here. But now, and then I came back to the United States and now he's taken off here, and they made a movie on Netflix, which I recommend people who like this book not ever watch any movie made off of this book, because they're all terrible. I know we all say that about every book of every story ever made, but they're really bad.
Okay.
I could see it being difficult to make this into a movie.
Yeah.
It's too beloved.
Even like a short animation that they just read the book behind. I'm like, it's all about your imagination.
Yeah.
The only acceptable version for me is if they did a reading with LeVar Burton.
Yes.
And they do the picture like reading Rainbow. Like, that's it. That's it for me. That's the only acceptable thing. But that's just me. I'm a purist. Obviously.
How about you, Victoria?
Yeah, these questions hit deep, Julia.
I'm sorry.
What did it bring up in me? I'm like, are we in therapy? Holy cow. I guess the first thing I thought of was just like my current situation with work has been very busy. And I mean, anyone who's listened to like more than like 2 episodes of this podcast has probably heard me say things along the lines of like, I need to take care of myself more. And like, I'm creating more boundaries in my life. And then like 3 weeks later, I'm like, I really should take care of myself more. So I'm a work in progress. But just as the Little Prince is going to each of these planets and meeting these adults, and you're just like, this is ridiculous. Like, you live in this beautiful universe of all these different planets. You can be doing so many different things. You could be talking to this really interesting being that just like showed up on your planet asking very good questions. And it's like, I'm too busy for you. I'm too busy for you. So as an adult reader, I'm like, yeah, I need to be reminded, like, it's not about the numbers that you're calculating or the power you think you have that no one even recognizes. And even with like the lamplighter, like realizing like when it's time to stop to question the rules, to question why things have to be the way they are. Some of like the biggest, mental breakthroughs I've had recently have been around that idea of like, well, why does it have to be this way? Mm-hmm. Why am I doing it that way? And I guess it was really beautiful to think about like, if we can connect more, if I can connect more with my inner child, like what kind of like better questions can I be asking myself? Like what creativity can I pull out of myself by connecting to the child and not just the facade of being an adult and like, I checked off all the to-do things this week. I did the adult thing, right?
I also loved your note of you want your memoir to be called Clarinets Don't Play Jazz and Other Lies, I believe. Sorry, that's your note for you to read, but I love that so much that I thought the world needed to know.
Oh, yeah. Julia, when you asked, like, what are some creative parts of you that might have gotten shut down when you were a kid, I had approached a music teacher in my life when I was playing clarinet and asked, like, hey, can I be in jazz band? Like, I just want to do more music. And the answer I heard was clarinets don't play jazz. Thinking back, knowing this person and the musician they are, it wasn't like you were incapable of doing that on the instrument. It was more like the style of jazz band we have, like, people don't play clarinets. But I just never continued the conversation. And so I never learned jazz. And I went to college and I studied music and I had to do some improv classes. And the whole time I was just kicking myself. I'm like, why did I believe that lie? That like clarinets can't do this? Like some of my favorite clarinetists out there are ones who are amazing at improv and like can blend the classical and jazz influences into their work.
Band is just crushing dreams left and right. I had something similar happen to me. I started on clarinet and I wanted to switch to percussion. And my mom said no. I had to do a year of the clarinet and prove I was serious about band because of course it sucked. You had to get up early, take the earlier bus, all that rigmarole. And she said if I stuck it out for a year that then I could take percussion. And then when I did, I went to change and the band teacher said it's impossible to switch from clarinet to percussion. You're too far behind after a year of morning band classes. You missed it. You're never going to catch up.
Oh,
and
what?
I believed it. Yeah, and I just quit clarinet and and percussion. And I just never picked up music again. Anyway, moving on.
For me, this book, well, like I said, I didn't realize the frame story of the narrator was there. And the introduction to this book, like, threw me for a loop. I was floored by it. I just thought it was the most incredible introduction to a book, like, ever written. And I was so surprised by it, because this could just be a book about a little prince, sort of an allegorical story, a little prince hopping around on different planets and learning about different people and sort of critiquing them, being like, well, why does it have to be that way? But it's also, on the outside of that, it's an adult who is remembering how his childhood creativity was crushed. The fact that he used his drawing of an elephant eaten by a boa constrictor to test adults later on in his life, to see like, hey, can we be real with each other or not? And every single adult that he ever met said it was a hat. And he's like, well, I can't show you my real self. Then finally he meets the little prince who like needs him to be creative, and he tries things out, and the first sheep isn't right and the second sheep isn't right, and he has to try it again, and then he's like, well, I can't draw a sheep, so I'll put it in a box. And the little prince is like, perfect, this is exactly what I wanted. And the fact that it frames the story within this feeling of crushed dreams and lost innocence, and just like something in the world has been lost and I need to go find it again. And I think that's the problem with the world as a whole. I think that's why all these bigger things are happening, is because we broke something in ourselves and we need to go find it again. And then you get the story of the little prince from that perspective. Completely changed the game for me. I was like so emotional reading it because it felt like we got the narrator's interpretation of the little prince. And so you could see how ridiculous everything was, and that he was sort of discovering how ridiculous everything was with the prince. And the description of what a bank is, I was dead. I had to put the book down. He's like, well, how do you own it? And it's like, you put it in a bank. And he's like, what's a bank? And how do you do that? And he's like, well, you put it in a box and you lock it. And I was like, holy shit. I had to stand up for a minute. I was like, I can't.
It's too real.
That is the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my life. And
yet
we view banks as like the paragons of steadfastness and safety and importance, like, oh, banking is important. And you're just putting things in a box.
Yeah.
Things that you don't own to begin with. Incredible. Yeah, I like, oof, man, I could go on and on and on, but it felt like such a powerful reminder to adults of like, what is the thing that you've lost? Look at how ridiculous all of this is. Look
Yeah.
at how ridiculous banks are. What is a bank? Why do you trust it? What is that in yourself? And yeah, I guess the main thing I got from it was like this sense of reassurance almost, and like feeling seen and validated. I was like, yeah, my deepest part of myself thinks that the adult world is ridiculous too, but I feel like I have to pretend that it makes sense. You know, that's like all adulting is, right? Is you're just pretending at being an adult or with everyone else who's pretending to be an adult, and we all pretend it makes sense. And to have someone say it doesn't is like such a relief.
I want the Little Prince's take on crypto.
Yes!
What do you think about Bitcoin, bro? I'm sure he's got some thoughts.
He's got questions for sure.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
That's amazing. Yeah, I would love that. We need a sequel. We need a sequel of The Little Prince going around to all these new, 21st.
Ethereum.
Yeah.
Dogecoin planet. To the moon. Oh my god.
Just have him meet Elon Musk and tear him to shreds.
Right. I do not think that Elon would be prepared for the realness that is the Little Prince asking a question and never letting it go.
Yeah.
No.
But what is an NFT? But I can just download it and own it on my computer now. Why do I need to pay $7,000 for it? But what does it do? What value does it have? And you would want this because?
Oh my god.
Exactly.
Excellent question. So that was kind of the main thing that I drew, and I feel so passionate. I feel like I need to go write a few essays about the introduction to this book. I need to get it out of my system because I can't fit it all here. But sort of our final question, I guess. The story of the Little Prince's journey is quite enough for a good children's book. So why is it important that the narrator is there as a character, and why is it told from his perspective?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, why do we care what a cishet white man thinks? Something I'm constantly asking myself when it comes to the narrators of my classic books, but let me try and unpack this.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we need him because it makes the story relatable. Because he's just a vehicle from which the story to happen, I guess. Yeah, it is kind of strange that the story is called The Little Prince. I think maybe it needs to be the author or the narrator, the pilot, whatever. I think it needs to be the pilot because it allows us as the reader to ask these questions about the Little Prince. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's why they did it that way. Because if it's sort of like the emperor has no clothes, like if we start with the Little Prince who says that we have no clothes, like where do we go from there? And maybe the story is somewhat more about this journey that's happening within the pilot of like, wow, you're right. The emperor does have no clothes. Why are we acting like he's not naked? Wow, 8-year-old child?
I like that.
I agree. It's kind of like this entry point as the reader. And I think we also, like, my one thought was like, okay, you could have done a very similar thing with this book, but I guess we kind of have an unnamed narrator. Like, we could have known less about the narrator and still had, like, this perspective on the Little Prince, if that makes sense. Like, some sort of, like, the narration could have told us some things of, like, oh, isn't it odd that he would ask this thing? But I think it really helps give, like, the child-adult juxtaposition. And it reminds me of, like, Toy Story. Like, when you watch it as a kid, there's a story you love about the toys.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you watch it as an adult, you love the story of Andy. Like, through the whole arc of, like, the movies.
Oh my gosh, when he went to college, I sobbed.
Right, yeah. Like, we realized we identified with that.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of gives you, like, maybe that's why it's such a lasting classic, too, because it gives something to the children, and they're like, planets and travel and, like, snakes and foxes, cool. And then to the adult reader, you, like, here's, like, a very specific person that you're supposed to identify with in this story.
Yeah, it kind of comes full circle.
Yeah, he gives you a way in, like, he kind of holds your hand.
There's another book that I love that I would recommend to people who like The Little Prince. It's called Illusions by Richard Bach, and I think the subtitle is Illusions of a Reluctant Messiah. And it's another story about white guys in biplanes. I don't know why this is a theme of my childhood favorite books, but it's like Richard Bach is this hapless guy who just goes around and he flies into fields and gives rides to people. And then he meets Donald Shimoda, who is this all-knowing messiah who has decided he doesn't want to be a messiah anymore. And then it's like about their journey and their truths and revelations that they come to. And it's a cute book. It's an easy read. It's a nice summer read. And I think if people enjoyed Little Prince, they would probably also enjoy Illusions. And if you haven't read it, go for it. Treat yourself.
All right. So some books. Well, I've already mentioned one. Books that I would recommend if you like this book. The Hobbit by John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Yeah, that one, like a children's book, but also not really a children's book, inspired by experiences in war and a real hatred of capitalism and technology, also a common theme. And then another one that's not a children's book at all, but has a similar theme of like questioning everything after a major world war. The play Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. It's more along the lines of nothing matters than along the lines of like, there is something that matters, just everything that's going on right now doesn't. So it's a little more nihilistic, but similar vein, I think, for me.
So my recommendation for those who enjoyed The Little Prince, one book that came to mind was The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. Very similar, like boy goes on a journey, learns a lot of life lessons, and kind of like a big allegory thing happening. I remember enjoying that when I read it in college, but it's been a hot minute for me to remember any more details than that. Another children's book that I thought would be great to read would be The Velveteen Rabbit by Marjorie Williams, because it just also has that like very like, oh, this means a lot. And this hits me in my heart as an adult. And I remember like, oh yeah, it's a book, let's read it as a kid.
Okay, and currently obsessed. This Way Up, Season 2, just launched. This is a comedy written and created by Aisling Bea. She is an Irish comic. It's streaming on Hulu. It's about a woman and her immediate circle who she comes out of rehab for something. I don't remember the premise of the show, but she's not doing great. And then you sort of watch her try to navigate everything with keeping up this wall of humor, basically. So it's terribly funny and like really it's gonna cut you to the quick in your emotions. And then I just watched the trailer for Halsey's upcoming album/film. So she's got an album dropping on August 3rd. And then I saw that she was doing like a film to go along with it. And I thought it was going to be like a Lemonade situation where it's like a visual album. But no, this is a legit horror film that is going to be airing in theaters, and it's shot on IMAX. The whole theme of the film and the album is about like her experience with pregnancy and childbirth, but it's set in, it's like a period piece, so there's like wigs and crazy makeup and these big corset dresses things, and it looks incredible. I'm so stoked. Yeah. And then I've also I wrote this down, and this is so stupid, but I've been spending a lot of time laying on my floor, and it's been oddly helpful. I feel like I do some of my best thinking down there. So I would encourage you to try it.
So yesterday I went to a movie theater for the first time in like over a year and a half. I can't tell you the last movie I saw before the pandemic, but I did see yesterday Black Widow with Scarlett Johansson and Florence Pugh, and I liked it. It was fun. I mean, it's a Marvel action flick. Like, you kind of know what you're getting into, but the fact that it was just, like, badass women the entire time with, like, a whole, like, sister story. I don't know. Of course, I cried at the end and was like, I love sisters. I wish I had a sister. We walked out of the theater. My partner turned to me and he's like, did you tear up at the end? I was like, yeah. He's like, were you wishing you had your own sister? And I was like, stop it. He knows me a little too well.
Obviously, I'm currently obsessed with myself, and I'm having a hot girl summer, getting vaxxed and waxed. So right now, I actually, my podcast is the Angry Indian Girl Radio podcast, and we are on hiatus. I have gone berry picking for the summer, so I will be returning in September to do new episodes. I was getting behind on my production. I was like, I didn't have time for anything other that was fun. So I was like, all right, capitalism can wait. Currently, what I'm doing is, now that I don't have to like plug my podcast all the time, I've been listening to some projects that my other friends have started, and my current obsession is the Camp Creep podcast, which is hosted by Lauren and Tish, and they basically are like two hottie goth camp counselors, and they just dish about horror stuff. Like, the first episode is about the Crypt Keeper, and I don't want to give anything away, but it's really cute, and I'm not really a horror person, but I'm friends with Lauren. So I wanted to check it out, and I think they do a really good job of making it accessible to fans all across the spectrum, whether you're super duper into horror or you're just, kind of a casual day browser like me. And I'm also super obsessed. I love the triad of the You're Wrong About podcast, Maintenance Phase podcast, and You Are Good. So it's like Sarah Marshall and Michael Hobbs do You're Wrong About, and then Michael also does a podcast with Aubrey Gordon about health and fitness, like myths. They bust myths on Maintenance Phase. And then the You Are Good is like where they talk about, it's Sarah Marshall and Alex Steed, and they talk about like daddy issues in shows. And I don't know, it just like, this has been my little trifecta of media consumption for the last month. I'm just going through their back catalogs, and yeah.
I love that. I'm the same way. If I find like a podcaster or a host that I enjoy, I'm like, what are all the things you're doing? And then then I meet their friends. I'm like, okay, now I have to listen to all the things they do. It's a great time.
Gotta become part of the friend group.
Yeah, that's my current obsession. And the Duolingo owl, he haunts me.
They need to make a horror movie about the Duolingo owl.
Right? Like, what you doing? Nothing. I know you're not studying Portuguese. Like, whoa, bro.
Yeah.
I'll do it. Sometimes I even go and I do a lesson I already did just because I just want to keep my streak. And I'm like, am I even learning at this point?
I'm just making the owl happy.
Right? It's
He
abusive.
rules my
It's an
life.
abusive relationship. I'm in an abusive relationship with the Duolingo owl.
Sophia, thank you so much for joining us. This was so much fun.
Yes! I had a blast.
Thanks for having me, and like I said, there's not a word for goodbye in Ojibwe, so I was just going to say Bamapi, which means until later. So Bamapi, Victoria, Bamapi, Julia. I'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Book Club with Julia and Victoria. Chime in with your own thoughts and recommendations on Instagram at bookclubwithjv or through the contact form on our website, www.bookclubwithjv.com. Our website is also where you can find show notes for this episode, which include links to any of the recommendations we gave or other tidbits we mentioned. Make sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're currently listening, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple while you're there. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Febland, and Rebecca Gesney is our project manager. We'll catch you all on our next episode. Happy reading!